Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner. I'm here with you today and glad to be here really to kind of continue a dialogue that we've been having about the will of God. We've entered now into the Jewish New Year, and so there are some correlating changes that we can reflect on, especially since we are people of faith. Even if you're not a person of faith, there might be some truths here that you can draw from that can benefit your life in your current context. But those people who ascribe to this podcast, those people that ascribe to the teachings that are shared here, this one's for you. We've been talking about the will of God. And what better way to enter into the Jewish New Year? What better way to enter into the next season of your life or your ministry? What better way to move forward from your current context into something better than to know how God's plan and God's will fits into your life? And that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about God's will in three dimensions. We've been talking about God's will in three dimensions. And through this series, we have emphasized practical tips for making sense of God's direction in the now. Practical tips. That means things that we can apply, things that we can do, things that we can engage in that helps us to make sense of how to, how to embrace, understand, and enter into God's direction in our now. We talked about this, and it's a correlation and an expansion of Hebrews 11:1. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. All we have in front of us is our now. The tomorrow never comes as a construct. Yesterday is but a memory, but what we have right in front of us is our now. If I lay down and take a 15-minute power nap, when I wake up, it's today, it's now. If I, sleep for 7 hours or sleep on a plane, when I wake up, it's now. In my now, in my current context, in my today, I need practical tips to make sense of God's direction. And so let's start out with this quote by Germany Kent about the will of God. The only way you're going to reach places you've never gone is if you trust God's direction to do things you've never done. The only way you're going to reach places you've never gone is if you trust God's direction to do things you've never done. It's a very powerful statement. It gets me to thinking about, I need to get outside of my comfort zone. I need to get outside the box, as it were. I need to experience the God that's much bigger than the box that I have grown accustomed to theologically, that I've grown accustomed to socially, spiritually, or whatever type of reality we want to put or attach to it. We need to experience God in a much larger and a bigger way. And as we learned the last time, that we found out that we, in essence, we have put God in a box. We have limited God to only being a certain way. We limited God to only relating to us a certain way. And we need to grow beyond that. We need to realize that ascertaining the will of God, that it requires a growth for us in many ways. The best way to put it is coming from Ephesians, where it talks about breadth, length, depth, width, and height. We need to expand our awareness of God and expand our awareness of accessing his will as wide as we can, as deep as we can, as high as we can, and all that's in between. It has to expand beyond what we've been taught about what we have learned. Now, am I saying anything against what we've been taught or what we've learned? Understand this: when it comes to understanding God, when it comes to growing spiritually, all that we've learned in the past is scaffolding. When you go out and when you see a building that's being built, and you see that as it goes up each layer, they have the scaffolding on the side of the building that is required for building. But once the building is built, the scaffolding is no longer needed. Sometimes the theological underpinning, sometimes the background, sometimes the experiences that we've had in life were but scaffolding to get us to our now. And right now, in our now, we need some practical tips that's going to enable us to know how to get God's will or how to enter into God's will more effectively. Let's think about this. In part one, we learned that through the act of stillness, we can get to know the will of God for our lives. We found out that if we get somewhere and sit down and become intentional through the act of stillness, then we can experience the reality of this truth. Be still and know that I am God. When we talked about the act of stillness, we focused upon a process that the scriptures refer to as meditation. And meditating not only in getting somewhere and getting silent and getting at a place of peace with your God so that your God can speak to you, but also through the act of stillness, we also learned that meditation includes contemplation on passages of scripture that speak to your life or passages of scripture that speak to the people of God. So through the act of stillness, we learn that we can get to know God's will. We need to know and become intentional through that act. We need to experience the reality of this truth, be still, and know that I am God. There is a knowledge of God that comes to us through stillness. In part two, we learned that how God uses our own mind to put us in a position to ascertaining what his will is for our lives. God uses our own mind so that we can ascertain what his will is for our lives. This process I coined as intellectual engagement, which is a process that requires renewing our mind. And we spent a lot of time on that the last time we were together, where we talked about Romans 12 and 2. And Romans 12 and 2 states, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. There I'm quoting from the King James Version. Be transformed, how? By the renewing of your mind. Through intellectual engagement, I renew my mind so that I can transform and so that I can ascertain what the will of God is. That I might demonstrate, that I might manifest, that I might realize and be, the will of God. And the will of God is perfect, is new, is refreshing, is also good. So there are two things we've learned in knowing God's will through this teaching: through the process of stillness and through the process of intellectual engagement. Today, we're going to discuss that through the process of going, we can discover God's will when we are in active pursuit of what little we know or just simple clues. Through the process of going, we can discover God's will when we are in active pursuit of what little we know, or just simple clues? You know, sometimes when it comes to knowing God's will, we want God to tell us everything. And then we get frustrated when he doesn't tell us everything, or we try to manufacture something to prove to prove something to ourselves or to prove to others that I am spiritual or that I am deep. Point is, God is not going to tell us everything, but he gives us some breadcrumbs that we can nibble on, because he wants us to realize that through the process of going, there's a participation between us and God to arrive at an awareness of what God's will for our life. We need to remain in active pursuit of what little we know. Go by that little breadcrumb. Go by that little simple clue. And once you get out there, we find out that God will give us the rest. So let's go into this particular story, a particular story that we're going to find in Genesis 12. But let me start it out by saying this. Sometimes we won't know until we go. Now, I didn't intend for it to rhyme, but there's a truth to it, and I want that truth to kind of settle in. Sometimes we won't know until we go. In Genesis chapter 12, beginning at verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram," and this is before he was called Abraham. "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in all families of the earth, in you, all families of the earth shall be blessed." Look at verse 4. "So Abram went as the Lord had told him." Now remember, I just said, sometimes we won't know until we go. As you see here in this story of Abram, he was in his father's house, and there's a lot of backstory as to what was going on in his father's house. But however, regardless of what the backstory is, and the backstory is important, so you want to know some more, go read some background, read some commentaries and what scholars have said about, his father's house, as it were. But this context was a precipice. This context was a platform by which he was to have a new beginning. Sometimes God speaks to us in our current situation and introduces to us a new beginning. Sometimes God speaks to us in our current situation and introduces to us a new beginning. And that's what it was here in the story of Abraham. God speaks to him and he tells him, get out of your country and from your kindred to a land that I will show you. Sometimes we won't know until we go. He gave him a breadcrumb and told him to get out, but he didn't give him any specifics until he left where he was. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot, which was his nephew, went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now let me say this. To all you Christ followers who have arrived at the precipice of being a seasoned citizen, we're never too old to fulfill God's will and purpose for our life. We're never too old to fulfill God's will and purpose for our life. Abram was 75 years old when he acted on a breadcrumb, when he acted on a clue, an inkling, a hunch. Get out from where you're at and go to a place that I will show you. One of the barriers that we have in our life here in our context today is that there is such a huge emphasis on youth. In fact, we can see it played out in how this society treats its older generation. Look at the commercials. They're always showing you someone that's youthful, or that you only use youthful characters to really display something. There's very little emphasis upon age. So in other words, we have a problem with ageism. God does not have a problem with our age. We do. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. God, when he calls us, he sometimes, through his calling, through his direction, enables us to transcend the isms of our current context. Sexism, racism, ageism, and whatever other kind of ism that could become a barrier that would cause us to second guess as to our usefulness for God. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarah and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go into the land of Canaan. Again, sometimes we won't know, or should I say, we won't get the full picture until we get away from where we are. We can't stay put. We can't stay in stasis or stay static and be able to embrace that which is active and effervescent and moving. It's easier to steer a car when it's moving than one that's standing still. Sometimes we won't know until we go. And so this was the case. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land of Shechem. Still, he's in active pursuit. To the oak of Moreh. Still, he's in active pursuit. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So, let's stop and think about it. He left from where he was. He took his wife, his cattle, all of his possessions, and his extended family, which was, Lot. And look at all the places that he began to travel in based upon something that he heard, or a clue that he got, or a hunch that he had. Just a little bit of knowledge of what God wished for his life. Get out from where you're at to a place I will show you. I'm not going to show you till you get out. Now that he left, he had gone through Canaan, he had gone through Shechem, he had gone by the oak of Moreh and to a place where the Canaanites was, and it was there, after having gotten out and gone through these necessary stages and steps, that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. Now, God is becoming more specific with Abraham about what his will is. And that is, number one, I wanted you to get out to show you what I'm going to give you. Sometimes the things that God won't give, the things that God wants to give us, he won't give it to us or show us what it is until we get out. There are things that God has held, and I'm saying this, if you want to take it prophetically, but most certainly, there are things that God has held in escrow for your life that requires you to do more than what you're doing, that requires you to depart from your comfort zone, that requires you to leave the land that you're so familiar with, to get out. Sometimes we won't know until we go. And so God has held this idea of what he had planned for Abraham, but he could not, he wanted to find out if Abraham was really trustworthy of what God had given him. And if you know the story of Abraham, we find out that God put Abraham's trustworthiness into engagement a little later on. When we find, if you read the story of Abraham, and we find out that at a certain point after God gave him a son, gave him and Sarah a son, in again their old age, what we find out is that God tells him, he challenges him, he said, look, now what I want you to do, I want you to offer up your son, your only son, as a sacrifice. And so what we find out that he did is that he took his son with him, and then he said to those servants that he had, I and the lad are going to worship, and I and the lad shall come back. We're going to return. And when he gets up there at the top of the mountain, and as he was about to draw back the knife to do what God said, his son said, where is the sacrifice? And Abraham said, the Lord will provide. But before he could come down with the knife, then there was a voice of the Lord, of angel of the Lord, or however God chose to speak to him. It was God's way of letting him know, now I know that you won't withhold anything good from me. Sometimes we got to realize that God has caused us to go through all the experiences that we've had up to this point, and then he puts our trustworthiness to the test. Abram's trustworthiness began when God told him to get out from your country and the land and your kindred unto the land that I will show you. So now here he is. He has come to this place, and now he's right by here, the land that's now occupied with the Canaanites, the land where those that would be expelled from the land are residing. The Lord appeared to him and said, to your offspring I will give this land. Notice he said, I'm not going to give it to you. Wow. A lot of us don't see that. Sometimes in God's will being realized in our life, he makes us the promise, but it happens in our posterity. He makes us the promise, but it happens to and through our offspring. There are things that God has willed that are to come through your generation. They may not come through your actual hands. They may not come into your particular time that you're currently living. They may not happen while you are yet alive in the mortal life that we know. But here he makes a promise, which is an indication that some things that are according to the will of God are not to happen to us directly, but to happen through us indirectly, such as our offspring. To your offspring, I will give this land. So the connection is these are going to come out of your loins, which means here he's talking to a 75-year-old man, and God is telling him, to your offspring, I will give this land, which is saying what? God had just gave him a clue that you're going to have a son in your old age. God just gave him a clue that I don't have a problem with ageism. God just gave him a clue that I've transcended biology. I've transcended your context. I've transcended the stigma associated with you and Sarah long before we even have the discussion about children. I'm telling you this right now. To your offspring, I will give this land. So as a consequence of what God said to him, he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. In other words, God spoke to him, and therefore he built an altar and worshiped and gave God thanks and transcended the moment with thanksgiving, praise, and worship. Verse 8, from there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. So then again, here again, that at these different places that he begins to move, through the process of going, and he comes to each place that he tabernacled, he built an altar. And in this case, the scripture says that he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. He was in concert and in participation with the will of God in his life, all because he chose to go. And because he chose to go, he chose to know. Verse 9, and Abram journeyed on by stages toward Negev. Well, now we run into a particular challenge, and I'm going to tell you something. When we are engaged, when we're in active pursuit of God's will, when we're in the process of going, it doesn't mean that everything we're going to experience is going to turn out just so hunky-dory. We need to get away from that theology that says, if we do it, we prophesy this or we confess this and decree this, that it's going to turn out according to these words of positivity. It may, but it does not always happen just like that. There are some times that we are engaged in an active pursuit of God's will, going by what little bit that we know, that we run into what I call pop-ups. Now, I have a military background, and when in training, when we were practicing on our weapons, we would have targets we shoot at. We have stationary targets, and we have to qualify on our stationary targets and receive a particular grade, as it were. But we would be trained upon moving targets, and then we would actually get assessed for that. But we would also have what is called pop-up targets. These are things that just pop up out of anywhere. When you least expect it, it pops up. And so in active pursuit of God's will, there are going to be times we have things that just pop up. Now, there was a famine in the land, and so Abram went down to Egypt. So notice he's continually moving from place to place with just an indication and a word. And he came to the first location, and God spoke to him, and that inspired him to keep on going. Now he's come down to the land, he come down to Egypt because why? There was a famine in the land. And to reside there in Egypt as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter into Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, an Egyptian saw the woman was very beautiful. Now, is this a case of situational ethics? And I'm not going to go into this, define what situational ethics are, because if you look it up, we see there's a lot of situational ethics going on about how people can excuse themselves to do certain things that are for the greater good or for this particular, is ethical for this particular situation. Is this a case of situational ethics, or did he just outright lie? Let's read on a little bit further. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. Watch this. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. The Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Well, we can see that this happened a little bit later, that God had afflicted Egypt and Pharaoh because not Moses' wife, but God's wife, Israel. That's just a correlation. That's just something I'm drawing from that. That there are times where God will go to bat for that which is his. And so this is what happened. The Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And so Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you've done to me?" My question is, how did he find out? How did he correlate that what was happening to him was because of the lie that he told? What is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her. Be gone. And Pharaoh gave his orders concerning him and set him on the way with his wife and all that he had. Maybe in preservation of God's will, maybe he already knew the situation and he already knew what kind of people they were. Maybe in him telling this particular story and engaging with what we would call a lie. And I'm not saying he didn't lie, but you can kind of see how whatever he said to Pharaoh worked out for good, because the real higher part of God's will is that I'm going to give you this land. The other fact is that they are a group of people that kill people for if they have a good looking wife. They're going to kill me. So if they find out that you are my wife, so tell them you're my sister. So there was a strategy toward what he said. And as a result, he did exactly that. And what happened, Pharaoh and that group of people got plagued because he took him as his wife. Now all Pharaoh wants to do is to get rid of Abram and his wife and his stuff. Get him out of here. Looks familiar, doesn't it? The same thing that happened before. Later on, we find out that that Egypt got plagued and Pharaoh was responsible. Get him out of here. Get him out of here. So Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him and set him on his way with his wife and all that he had. That's in Genesis 12, 10 through 20. Well, what have we learned here? There are three things that I want to add in our takeaway from what we've learned today through the process of going. Sometimes when we're on the path of doing God's will, he will deal with our enemies in the process. And that's one of the things that we can see here. Secondly, we need to be aware of our environment and potential pitfalls along the way. Even when God tells us to go, he doesn't want us to go blindly. God wants us to assess what's going on. In fact, he had told, Moses, and he told them later on when he sent 12 spies to go out and to check out this same land that they were going to possess. He says, look, send these 12 spies and let them come back. Let them do reconnaissance. Let them come back and tell me. And tell the people what we're dealing with. Assess the environment. Be aware of potential pitfalls. God doesn't want us to act on anything that he said without our eyes open. God does not want us to act on anything that he said without our eyes open. Be aware of your environment. Be aware of potential pitfalls that could present themselves along the way. Be aware of certain cultural pop-ups that could pose to be a problem. Maybe they think a certain way. Maybe they act a certain way. Maybe there might be something about you that you need to be aware of so that you know how to navigate this potential pitfall. And lastly, always be in pursuit of what you believe to be God's will, and He will lead you, He will protect you, and He will keep His promise. Well, I trust you've been blessed today in knowing God's will through the process of going. What we've talked about here should inform us as to how to navigate in our now, how to be an active one who's actively in pursuit of God's will. Maybe you're going by a hunch. Maybe you're going by just a simple word. You do your part, God does His. He gives you a word, you walk by faith. But walk with your eyes open, walk circumspectly. Don't walk as a fool or one that's unwise. Assess your environment, but know this, you won't know until you go. God bless you. We'll see you back here next time.